Welcome, Adelaide. Come on in.
Oh, I don't have the login details for our restream. Does anybody else have them? Trish? Trish, could you share the restream login details with me by DM, please?
Welcome, everybody coming in as we're waiting a few minutes here. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and give us your name and pronouns if you want and where you're joining us from. We're gonna give people a few more minutes to file in and get settled, and then I'll introduce Ornella. Welcome, Bill and Julie and Paul. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and we're going to start shortly. Welcome, Michelle. If you're comfortable turning your cameras on, then we can see each other and help build community a little bit, but certainly not necessary. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Give us your name and pronouns, where you are, and what your flavor of science is. I see we've got Dr. Adelaide Johnson coming in from Alaska, and a new rebel. Welcome. We'll get started
Hi,
shortly. Oh, great to see you.
nice to see you all.
Yeah. Welcome to SR. Okay, I'm just gonna get started with this. I would like to warmly welcome all of you to our okay, we're recording this. Welcome to our initial um, talk in a series we hope to continue for some time, titled Buen Vivir. We at Scientist Rebellion Turtle Island see that it's really important that we look to the deepest causes for the many catastrophes that we're facing. And this series of talks is our attempt to bring the voices to the table that we need to hear in order to help us chart a path to all the kinds of justice that we need for the world that we want to live in. Today, we're thrilled to kick this off with one of our own, Ornela De Gasperin. She is a scientist in Mexico, working with Scientist Rebellion Global and Scientist Rebellion Abiyala. She holds an honors degree in biology from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and a PhD in zoology from the University of Cambridge. With postdoctoral research in ecology at both the University of Lausanne and the University of Freiburg in Switzerland, Dr. Ornella currently serves as a professor in ecology at the Institute of Ecology in Ecole, where she's been since 2023. Dr. Ornella has given many, many talks, is super respected as a rebel and as a scientist, and also is just a general kick-ass person. And I couldn't be more happy to introduce her and hear what she has to say. Take it away, Ornella.
Thank you very much. And I'm just gonna share my screen. So can you see my slides there? All good? Yeah, can I
Yes.
get a, okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. So yeah, my name is Ornella, and I've given a lot of talks of climate change because I spent many years during my PhD and postdoc believing that a magic technique will save us and that everything was going to be fine. And then when I started to read the science of climate change, I was completely shocked at the state of knowledge and how everything was moving in the wrong direction. And then I got obsessed with understanding why. And then I got obsessed with informing other people in the hope that with enough informed people, something could change. So I'm going to give a brief overview, and there are going to be about 8 key messages throughout the talk. And I want to start first with the conclusions from the last IPCC report. For those who don't know what the IPCC is, this is a panel of close to 600, 700 scientists that provide very large reports to the United Nations regularly. So they've given 6 full reports. Each report has 3 working groups, and each working group is a report of about 2,000 and 3,000 pages. So when I'm quoting the IPCC, I'm really quoting a scientific consensus, not a single paper. And these are some of the key messages from the last report from the second working group published in 2022. And I think it basically summarizes what I have to say in 4 sentences. The first is that climate change is a threat to human well-being and planetary health. The second is that there is a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. The third is the choices and actions implemented in this decade will have impacts now and for thousands of years. And the fourth is that targeting a sustainable world requires fundamental changes to how society functions, including changes to underlying values, worldviews, ideologies, social structure, political and economic systems, and power relationships. So I'm going to go one by one, showing data of why this is the scientific consensus. So the first thing we know is that we're in a state of planetary emergency. And to understand why, we need to understand the most important concept in the climate sciences, in my opinion, which is tipping points. So in our planet, there are several huge, like very large scale systems, such as the ice sheets or the Amazon rainforest, which have more than one stable state. This state is very strong to perturbations. But if we perturb that system enough, we get to this point. That's the tipping point. And once we reach this point, that system will transform unstoppably into a second state. So it doesn't matter what we do. Once we reach a tipping point in a specific system, we're going to lose or transform that system completely, no matter what. At least in human timescales. We know from paleoclimatical data that these systems have this more than one state, and throughout millions of years, they've been in one or the other. So the more we pollute, the more we're pushing all of these systems into their tipping points and into transforming the planet completely. So the more we pollute, the more we're really pushing these systems to their tipping points. Now, we know of several huge systems which regulate the capacity of our planet to sustain our societies and to keep life on Earth, basically. So we have the AMOC, the Amazon rainforest, the Greenland ice sheet, the boreal permafrost. So all of these could tip into another system. Now, we've known this for decades. This is a paper that was published in 1987 in Nature, and it says, we're playing Russian roulette with the climate, and no one knows what lies in the active chamber of the gun, referring to tipping points. Now, since then, we've had a lot of research regarding tipping points. And this report, which came out last year, 2 years ago, which is 500 pages long, published, written by 200 scientists from 90 research centers. They conclude that harmful tipping points in the natural world pose some of the gravest threats faced by humanity. Their triggering will severely damage our planet's life support system and threaten the stability of our societies. So basically, we could reach a point of enough heating and deforestation that would tip the Amazon rainforest unstoppably into a savanna. Similarly, for coral reefs, they could die until they're all bleach worldwide. And just to give you a number, roughly 1 billion people depend on coral reefs for survival. The AMOC is probably the one that terrifies me the most. So this is an ocean circulation current, which goes from basically the north, geographic north, and it goes down as cold water, and then it comes up as warm water. So this system is slowing down, and if we cross the tipping point, it will stop completely, and that would be unstoppable. So that would be the collapse of the AMOC. And these are some of the repercussions we would see if the AMOC collapses. So basically, rainfall would shift to the global south, which would bring a flooding, massive flooding in areas that's usually not that humid. Lots of drought in the tropics, so Mexico would be screwed. There would be massive cold temperatures in, for example, Scotland. People would probably not be able to live there. And it's estimated that, for example, 50% of the area where we grow corn and wheat would disappear. So if the AMO collapses, I think our societies will collapse. It's something, I don't think we can adapt to an AMO collapse. And with enough heating, we will push the AMOC into a collapse, and it doesn't matter what we do. Even if we had technology to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and put it back into Earth, if we cross the tipping point, that process it's unstoppable. Okay, so at what time will this system tip, and why is it so important? And we insist, scientists, on keeping temperature ideally at 1.5. And this is the scientific consensus. So there are at least 6 of these huge systems whose central estimate for tipping is at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that's why we don't want to go beyond 1.5. Now, sadly, we're headed towards a 3.2 degrees of heating by the end of the century. This is an IPCC plot, which makes it virtually certain we'll cross several of these tipping points. So if we continue down this path, we'll transform the planet unimaginably. So just coming back to this, if we're going to 3.2, we're sure we're going to cross the tipping point of the Greenland ice sheet, which means it will melt unstoppably, and several others. Now, one of the most scary parts of tipping points in our planet is that they influence one another. So the more the Greenland ice sheet is melting, it's adding fresh water into the AMOC, which is slowing it down. So the defrosting of the Greenland ice sheet can lead to the tipping of the AMOC, which reduces humidity in the Amazon rainforest, which means it sucks less CO2 and emits more heat. So it's more likely that we'll tip other elements. So basically, we could have a domino effect where tipping one system could lead to the tipping of other systems. And these risks have been underestimated. So in the first IPCC assessments, they thought it was highly likely to cross these tipping points only after 5 or 6 degrees of heating. And so the more we understand the systems, the more we realize they're actually a lot more sensitive. Sorry, that's a different in Spanish and English, and I get confused. But they react a lot more to our perturbations. So the more we study them, the more we realize we're in a crisis. So that's the first thing I want to mention. The second message I want everybody to understand is that this is a social injustice. So 92% of emissions, if we control per capita for historical emissions and for consumption emissions, 92% have been done, or the global north, what we call the economic center, has contributed with 92% of these emissions. However, 98% of current deaths are happening in the global south. So just to give you some examples, these are the impacts on agriculture. So how many people are in famine because of climate change, and regions like the north of Africa, which has in no way contributed to climate change and has been historically colonized by violence, then colonized by death, is having some of the highest rates of famine because of climate change not produced by these countries. Billionaires pollute more than several countries. So Carlos Slim, who's a billionaire in Mexico, pollutes twice as much as the country Haiti and 1 million times more than an average Mexican. There was a recent report in 2024 by Oxfam, which said that 1.5 hours of life in a billionaire is equivalent to the whole pollution of an average person on a lifetime. So billionaires are really our enemies, and that's their personal emissions, not even through their enterprises. So their investments and their private jets and their houses. So this is a graph where they separated human beings by how much wealth they have. So the richest people pollute the most. They own 76% of the wealth. They produce half of the emissions, and they're currently not suffering almost any of the damages. And the poorest people are not polluting almost anything. They own only 2% of the wealth, but they're suffering the highest consequences. So just to give another data, one transatlantic flight, as well as 1 hour of private jets, pollutes more than 1 in 2 humans in a year. And this is, we had a Wim Theory giving a talk for SR. I invite you to watch this video in YouTube. And this is also the injustice according to generations. So somebody who was 60 years old in 2020 would see almost no heat waves in their lifetime, for example. But somebody who was 0 years on 2020 would have 36 heat waves in their lifetime. So people who are not responsible for the world that we're having are going to suffer the consequences. Now, I don't need to show you that many cases. I'm going to show you just a couple. So Pakistan, who's emitted less than 1% of global emissions, had floodings that affected 33 million people, half of them children. And the same happened in Brazil. It was massive floodings. And that was at 1.3 degrees of heating. And you know, the world is burning, flooding, and drying at the same time. And whenever I give this talk, people say, okay, so this is the new world order we need to get used to, right? And the reality is that this is just the beginning. This is the best world we could hope. So according to the IPCC, the current trajectory puts basically 1 in 2 people in a situation of migration or death by the end of the century. So this is a direct quote from the IPCC, and it's 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change. This is a projection of water stress for the year 2050. So Mexico, I don't know what's going to happen with me and my friends and my family. And I just want to point that 1 in 2 people live here. So all of this hydric stress will be affecting 1 in 2 people. So I think we can agree we're in a situation of emergency, that this is a complete injustice. And now the third thing I was very shocked to understand is that we've known this with a very important consensus for decades. So we understand the process of global warming for basically hundreds of years now. Governments know it very well since at least 1988. So this is James Hansen, who's a scientist from NASA, and he was also an activist, or he's still an activist, and he testified in front of the Congress, of the American Congress, in the year that I was born, saying that climate change is happening and we need to stop it for our own safety. So virtually all countries in the world agreed to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system in the year 1992. Nevertheless, we've polluted more since all countries agreed to reduce pollution than in all of previous human history. So we can see these are years at the bottom. At the y-axis is the parts per million of CO2, which is basically a direct link with global atmospheric temperature, and the bars indicate the temperature. So we've had 29 conference of the parties where people from basically all governments get together and discuss how they're going to protect us from climate change and mitigate this problem. We've had 6 IPCC assessments, and the only thing that keeps changing is the temperature and how many heat waves and hurricanes and everything happens. This is another graph which shows clearly how we've polluted more since countries agreed to prevent climate change than in all of human history. So I added the line to mark 1992. And something that's important to mention is that the climate change is one of many crises we're facing. So we are entering the 6th mass extinction, with species extinctions rate reaching between 100 and 1,000 times higher than what's safe for us. We're having land system use. We're extracting more water than what Earth can replenish. And what's more stressful is that as years go by, we keep pushing all of these boundaries of all of these system boundaries. So these are the planetary boundaries. They're not tipping points. We could potentially come back to an area of safe operating system. But we see the same pattern as with climate change. As years go on, we keep exceeding what safety, what would be safe for us. This is material extraction, which we're also overshooting, and this is also completely unjust. So high-income countries are by far having very high material footprints, whereas low and middle-income countries are not consuming as many materials as would be just. So we have a scientific consensus, which is growing. Despite the scientific consensus, emissions are growing, human suffering is growing, and this is happening year after year and decade after decade. So why is this? So I'm going to use our opinion in SR is that we're not really addressing the root cause. And I'm going to use fast fashion as an example of the root cause. So the textile industry produces 20% of industrial water pollution, close to 35% of microplastic pollution to oceans. It consumes 79 trillion liters of water. And just to give you an example, that was something I was shocked because I didn't know how bad it was. But a single polyester shirt requires 12,000 liters of water to produce, which is what a person would drink in 10 years. It's manufactured in the global south, where only 2% of workers have a salary that allowed them to cover their basic needs. And there was the collapse of Rana Plaza, a manufacturing place that led to over 1,000 deaths and over 2,000 people wounded there. Okay, the textile industry is producing over 92 million tons of trash per year. 88% of textiles end up either in the trash or burnt. They're mainly in the global south. So in the Atacama Desert in Chile, there is a pile of trash of clothes, which is now visible from the moon, I've read. It produces around 8% of global emissions, and these emissions are expected to grow by the year 2030. Now, 40% of the clothes is never sold or worn. So it's produced, manufactured, it travels the whole world, and then it goes into the Atacama Desert as trash, 40%. So why are we producing more clothes? Why, in the middle of a climate catastrophe, is this industry still growing? When will there be enough clothes? That's probably a question that a child would ask, right? Like, at what point do we have enough clothes? And the answer to that is never. Our economic system does not project an end to the growth of all economies and all economic sectors that contribute to GDP. So why are we not stopping the crisis? Because we're not really attacking the root cause. This is just a symptom of something deeper and systemic, which is the economic system. I like this idea. It's this infinite growth that's going to basically finish all life on Earth if we continue on it. This is a poster by a student called Rosalia Cordero. So the economic system has adapted the idea of increasing GDP exponentially and never stopping, right? And we know that GDP is tightly linked to the increase of emissions and of material footprint, material use. Now, the growth of GDP is meant to be exponential, right? We have to grow our economies 3% every year, which means it doubles every 24 years. And this is an exponential growth, just as a virus growth. So in this graph, I'm showing on the left the growth of COVID. You can see the exponential behavior. And on the right, this is the growth of global GDP. So GDP keeps growing exponentially year after year. Now, because of this, we're always using more materials and we always need more energy because we're growing all industries that contribute to GDP growth, which means that we're not replacing any of our sources of energy with renewables. They're just adding up to a growing economy. And what's more irrational, if you think about it, if we have a society that's sick, that needs to spend money on medicine, that's going to have a lower GDP than a society that's healthy. So if you're healthy and you don't need to pay for any medicines, you have a lower GDP. So that really speaks about the irrationality of the system, of what's actually being considered into GDP and GDP growth. Now, something happens in a growth-oriented economy, which is very dangerous, and that's called the rebound effect. This is something that we've known basically since the Industrial Revolution. So in a growth-oriented economy, any gain in efficiency becomes our enemy. So this is how aviation has become more efficient across years. And it's now 20 times more efficient than in 1950, which in a rational world should lead to 20% less emissions, right? But the emissions from aviation keep rising, which means that all of the money they're saving from fuel goes into investment into more planes and more routes. And I invite you to go to this website, Stay Grounded. They have a lot of information on aviation in specific. So this is very dangerous because we would ideally want efficiency to help us. So more efficient batteries for our solar panels would be our friend. But in a growth-oriented economy, it could become our foe. And it's also an idea that's everywhere, right? Efficiency is going to save us. Well, not in a growth-oriented economy. Now, the economic system is completely rigged against the global south. So in the World Bank, there is this, I don't know if anybody knows about it. I was very shocked when I learned. It's called ISDS, Investor State Settlement Dispute. So many countries signed it. Mexico entered it in the 90s. And this system, it's a legal system that allows corporations to sue governments, but governments cannot sue corporations. So that means that BP can or Exxon can sue Mexico if we raise the minimum wage, for example, or if we have an environmental protection law, because those are economic laws for the corporation. So, for example, Mexico has to pay $40 million to a Canadian mining company because it didn't allow to do deep sea mining in our oceans. Okay. So I know this is awful, and I know it's also very difficult to speak about it, but there is hope. So there is hope if we really change our society. So I want to go back to this consensus from the IPCC. Targeting a climate resilient, sustainable world involves fundamental changes to how society functions, including changes to values, worldviews, ideologies, social structures, political and economic systems, and power relationships. And I think after all of what I've said, it makes sense why we need to change all of this. But I want to show you this. So this is a climate safe world. This is So that's something we can do as much as we want. That doesn't pollute. We can spend as much time with friends, as much time dancing as we want. And Julia Steinberger, who's also in SR, and she's an activist and a climate scientist, she's found that if we focused our economy into human flourishing instead of just growing every economic sector that provides to GDP, independently of whether that sector is useful, like health, or not, like fast fashion, we could give 10 billion people amazing lifestyles using 60% less energy. So we don't need new technology. All we need is to reorient our economic systems into something more rational and focus into human well-being. So for me, the main conclusion I always take is that climate policies are economic and social policies. So we need to stop treating rights as commodities, which includes job and housing guarantees, and we can have luxury in public goods. So once we remove unemployment from the table, we can actually start decreasing economic sectors which are damaging our planet without having people in unemployment. And we need to tax the rich out of existence. So the moment we start to tax the rich, that's a climate policy. It's either them or us, basically. So having a very strong social protection for everybody could allow us to eliminate all of those economic sectors which are useless like fast fashion, private jets, single-use plastics, publicity, which get us into consumerism, obsolescence, pre-programmed obsolescence, so how they program our stuff to fail so that we have to buy new stuff. But we can focus on human well-being, so we can really increase free time, time with family, time dancing, time with friends. So it's actually quite a nice world. We could work like 2 days a week in useful jobs such as growing food, education, health, and then just have more free time, right? So this would be a climate resilient world. However, any delay in working to get that world is going to basically close that very brief window of opportunities to secure a livable future. Basically, we're very close to crossing tipping points. So if we don't build that world fast, we're going to cross tipping points and then we're going to lose our planet. So that's the scientific consensus, and the world is acting against this consensus. So the world plans to produce twice as much fossil fuels by 2030 than what would be compatible with limiting global heating to 1.5. And the worst part is that's going into industries like, army, private jets, yachts. It's not going into, okay, let's build all the trains we need to move people and goods around. So I think what we need to conclude as scientists is it doesn't matter how strong a scientific consensus we have. It really becomes very small because we're facing corporations, we're facing institutions, and we're facing billionaires who are consciously or unconsciously trying to prevent the systemic changes we need. I don't know if you understand why I put all of this. If you have questions, you can ask at the end. I want to mention Boeing, which is an airplane manufacturer, and also it's producing the bombs that's falling in the genocide. BlackRock City, they're finance institutions. We choose money to put basically money into the actions of the worst enterprises. And I put the New York Times because I don't know if you know, but they have a lot of sponsored content. And so they received millions of dollars to have sponsored content from Exxon and BP, where they talked about doubt about the climate crisis for decades. Billionaires, I don't need to talk more about them, and this we can talk at the end. He said in 2023, let me be categorically clear, our shareholders need to see high returns. And I really like this Chomsky quote, which is, we don't have words in our language that explain what's happening. We have a scientific consensus that this is going to basically transform planet to the point that our societies are unlikely to adapt. We know it, and people keep pushing towards that because that puts more money into their pockets. Evil doesn't start to approach it. And I think we need to understand this is not a problem of information. We've had 6 IPCC reports, and it's not a problem of communication, at least not from the science. This is a problem of power. So what should we do as scientists, as academics and humans? And I guess that's the big question, right? How can we really push for those changes we need? And I think we need to focus on the humanity now, not on the science. We have all the science we need counterpower. And it really means we need to stop pretending like this is fine. We can't just go back to our labs, publish more papers. I mean, what's the point of having better predictions if we're just going to sit around and watch how they come true? So that's why we really need to go into the streets, go into the media, build a massive social movement and build information in societies to resist what's happening, basically. And I mean, social movements can change the world. For example, I have a PhD, not because men in power gave women the right to education. It was something that women had to fight for, and they won. And now I have a PhD thanks to these brave women. And I guess the hope that I have is that social movements can grow very fast. So as tipping elements in the climate system are not linear, also social movements are not linear. So this is 2018 with a single girl saying, this is crazy, why am I studying if I have no future? And then a year later, there were thousands of people on the streets. And people get very creative, but movements grow very fast. So this was the feminist movement in 2019. So it was 6 women in Chile who started a dance, and that became a huge movement that really changed a lot of the narrative, of the discussion, and at least in Mexico City, of the attitude of men towards women in the street. I saw it firsthand. And so SR wants to build that revolution in academia and take academics into the street to inform and to help build a larger social movement of resistance. So we're a global movement of scientists and academics. We engage in civil disobedience. We're decentralized and horizontal, and we are now in 30 countries. And we really focus on equity and justice and the economic basis of the climate crisis at the core of any discussion. And I think for me, it's actions way more than words. So we can say we're in a crisis, but if we just go back to the lab, nobody really believes us. So if we continue with life as usual as academics, nobody's going to believe we're in a true crisis. And we have a lot of actions, and we've had some gains. For example, SR Netherlands has been blocking private jets in Schiphol airport, and the airport had to block private jets because it was so annoying to have activists around, right? So the conclusion I take from all of this, or that I want you to take, is that if we don't have an economically just world, we're not going to have a climatically safe one. Today, we have the most unequal world we could ever believe we have, and we're in a very dangerous zone. So I want to put these two posters from students that they talk about inequity and how CO2 is basically death. And just something to cheer you up a little bit. So these two, which make me laugh. So the koala doesn't have a mental health problem. The problem is the world. And no, we don't need more jobs. I mean, we need job guarantee and a different economic system. So I also want to put these. So these are documentaries talks for all of the different parts that I talked, and some I didn't cover so much, like false solutions, like recycling, techno-optimism, green growth. I didn't want to make it so long, but I recommend that you see all of these documentaries. And I think that's it. So I'll stop sharing now.
Amazing, Ornella. Thank you so much for that talk. A little bit like sipping from the fire hose. You like 37, like you basically went through all that in a half an hour. So that gives us plenty of time to have questions and discussion here. And I apologize that we did not have the chat enabled, as I was saying earlier. So for those of you who tried to share who you were in the chat, you'll find that that wasn't actually a thing that you could do. But we can see questions that are posted in the chat. So we can go through the ones. I have two of them here that we can go with. And then I think there's just not that many people. So maybe we can have people come off mute to ask questions after that. So either write your questions for Ornella in the chat, or wait, and then we'll let people go off mute when we get through these first two. So from Paul English, who asks, what are your thoughts of the new president of Mexico, Dr. Sheinbaum, and what do you think she can do about the climate crisis?
Thank you. So I personally like her a lot. Of course, I'm talking as an individual, not as SR, because we're not affiliated to any political group. I personally like her a lot. I think they're really trying to build a counterpower to some deep problems. So trying to have energetical autonomy, trying to have more food autonomy. However, I don't think there is any political way of changing all of these problems. And I think that's something we really need to realize, is that no matter who gets into power, they're really threatened by everything, by international law as the ISDS, by like corporate banks, by, it's very difficult for anybody within institutional ways to change such systemic problems, right? So for example, Mexico had in 2023, we had a constitutional law that changed. So from the 90s, by constitutional law, water was priority for mining and industry and not for human use. So only 14% of water goes into domestic use in Mexico. And we had a we changed the law basically in 2023. So that wasn't Claudia Sheinbaum, it was the previous president. But because of that, we had like over six sues in the ISDS in the World Bank, right? So mining companies started to sue Mexico. And so no matter what government, there's, I think, severely limited in what they can do. And they also don't have the the possibility of having the correct narrative. I don't think a political candidate can go and say we don't want economic growth, right? So I think they need to play within certain like narratives which are pushed by mass media. And I mean, for example, this government is trying to push back, so having a lot of interventions in public spaces every day to change the narrative, to inform people in other way, like basically to like counteract what mass media does. But I think we have to do a lot as citizens uh, to help or to protect us from any political party, because I don't think people understand the level of crisis we have. Like I think Claudia Sheinbaum understands because she was an IPCC contributor, but in previous reports. But I don't think she could say like, okay, now we're gonna expropriate, all of these houses and redistribute them. It would be chaos in mass media, and that's where I think scientists, we need to be pushing this as a like this is a solution. Like it's better to have like housing rights through redistribution than to build any infrastructure, no matter what energy you use. And I think it's us that we need to go into media, we need to go into the street, we need to push for really something that sounds like extreme narratives, but in my opinion are just very rational and logical, and they're supporting by data. And then we can like flip society's opinion also, and then help political parties or people who have the right idea but maybe don't have the social support, or really just go against the political people who are not in any way interested in its societies.
Great. Yeah. Just to paraphrase what I heard there, we have, as scientists, we have social capital that we can use to say things out loud as scientists that may seem radical to people that haven't really questioned things. And by that, we can use the radical flank effect to move the center of conversation to be able to have people start to address these core issues.
Yeah, and as scientists, it's relatively easy to get into media, for example, so we have a lot of credentials that open door for us, and I think we really need to capitalize on that and like use it to talk about these issues with our narrative, not really replying to the typical questions that come from mass media, but really pushing for the narratives we want to question, like how can a single person pollute more than a country? And like if nobody answers that, I don't want to discuss solar panels. Like I just want to start at the really real root. Like it's just the most important question, like because it's also the like very few people will suffer if we block private jets, if we reduce aviation, because people not a lot of people use it. So we really need to push our own narrative rather than just like play by the like narratives that mass media are giving us, which are very limited.
Amazing. Yeah. Okay, the next question. The US and Canada depend on Mexico for many foods. How has the extreme heat and drought affected agriculture in your country? Should we be buying avocados?
I mean, as individuals, we have very little power as consumers, but collectively, we can really push for changes, right? So that's called a boycott. So I think what we really need to build is like boycott power. And ideally, we need more like independence from other countries everywhere. Like we just need to grow on our own food everywhere, so that food doesn't have to travel, because emissions from from moving is one of the drivers of climate change. And again, I think we need to push for some very radical thoughts. For example, half of the food goes into waste. So it's not just like whether we eat meat, but we really need to push for reforms that like prevent food waste, for example, and that uh, incentivize like local food production rather than, all of these global markets. It's also I think a safety bet, like because climate change is here, like we are already seeing terrible heat waves, we've seen crops failing, we've seen uh, terrible things. So we need a lot of diversity, I think, in our food systems. Like we can't just go for monocultures in a single place because it's really putting all of our eggs in a basket, and that's very dangerous in this new world that's very unpredictable and very dangerous. So we need, in my opinion, a lot of diversity in our food systems and a lot of local production of foods.
Right. Yes. Yes. Okay, there are a few more questions, but I'm going to take my privilege as a moderator to ask my own. What can we in North America, in the US and Canada, with our privilege and our bigger megaphones, what can we do to help? What should be our responsibility with that privilege?
I mean, I think really join worker unions, which are one of the strongest counterpowers in the world. Collectives, go to the street, talk to people, try to get into media, try to take this narrative. Like we needed one Greta to start like a global movement, right? So like I think we have a lot of work to do just informing people of these like core issues. And for me, it's really hoping that something will kick off, like somehow protests, somehow worker unions will. That's my hope. It's basically just inform nonstop, act nonstop, and yeah, that I mean I wish I knew better, So in SR Mexico, we're trying to cover. So we made links with like journalists. So we have now space regularly in like which are very visible. We're on the streets weekly with like flyers, and we're giving presentations. So we're going to universities. We're like it's basically what we can do. If somebody has a better idea, I'll be very happy to change our strategies. But that's what I think, and I think because all of the issues in the world, they're manufactured, right? Like we're stressed about losing our jobs, we're stressed about losing our housing, and all of this is not necessary. So like if people realize we have enough infrastructure for everybody, we just need billionaires to stop renting these places expensively and give us the right to housing. I mean, people would support this, right? Like nobody wants to be in unemployment, in a situation of unemployment, because all of this is manufactured by the system. They need us stressed and scared and alone. So like in a way, it's this narrative of like, yeah, climate change is scary, but like the counter to climate change is economic security, which we all want. And I think that narrative can be hopeful. I don't know, that's my view, but I'm very happy for other opinions on what to do. And yes, the slides will be available. I can email them to anybody. So I have a personal web page and they're open, but they're in Spanish. So now I translated them and I can send them.
Great, great. Okay, the next question looks like this one is from Greg. So much messaging about economics assumes that growth is good. It's baked into our brains. What are some simple messages we can adopt to challenge this idea, knowing that in most circumstances we will not be able to pull up 30 slides in a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to spend some time thinking about like like really good, like short sentences. And I mean, for me, for example, we have a very academic discourse that we use the word degrowth, which I think it's not really helpful. Like I didn't use the word degrowth, despite the fact that everything I said aligns with degrowth, right? And I think we can just say things like, well, grow housing security and economic security to all, and yeah, growth of what, right? And deep down, it's also who decides what grows. Like who's deciding fast fashion should grow, and that's the lack of democracy in the world, right? Like we are assumed to have more, private jets and more and more like trash clothes, which like who's deciding that? So we can grow the things like sports and salsa dancing and economic security for everybody, and then we don't need to use the word degrowth, or we just go to like something that really matches what people feel, I think. And I think it's also trial and error. We need to go to the street and see what message like gets to people. Like it's not going to be the same for a child. So another thing I'm trying is like, yeah, I prefer to be able to flush my toilet in 10 years, right? Like, so maybe just that's very tangible to of what's happening and what will happen if we continue down this path.
Great. Marion writes, solidarity with Mexico from Norway. Had the same question about Mexico's political situation and what can be done and will be done to address especially water issues.
I don't know what's like, I don't see enough adaptation happening. I think the projections for hydric stress, we should really like start adapting also, like having, for example, dry toilets, which save 50% of the water. And we really need to go against industry, like, because water, Coca-Cola doesn't have any water issues. Like, it's regular people who have water issues. And there is all of this narrative around that, showering like a minute. And when you talk to people on the street, they really talk about like taking care of water. And it's like, well, maybe boycott Coca-Cola is better. Like, and that could make a counterpower and push for government to say like give us like an employment right so people don't have the obligation to work for Coca-Cola, like, because people will take any job to pay for their rent and to have security for their children. So what we need is an option for people, for everybody, like share jobs that are useful. And yeah, tax the rich. Like we have Carlos Slim and Larrea, and we have like billionaires. So Mexico is very unequal. So in Mexico, we also have a lot to do against our own billionaires.
Okay. Troy writes, what do you think about bird dogging the powerful as a strategy?
I don't know what's bird dogging.
Bird dogging is finding people and confronting them in the public. That's what climate defiance does. A lot of times, Greg did that once with climate defiance. But yeah.
I don't know, maybe Greg, you can talk more about it because I haven't had the opportunity to meet like somebody I could bully, although I would like to do it.
Yeah, well, your example of Carlos Slim, for example, public appearances by people like that are easily identified as climate villains that could be shamed or heckled or called out is this strategy of bird dogging. And how I think Troy's asking, how useful do you think that general tactic is for advancing these messages? Check.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not against it in any way. I think it can lead, for me, like the most important feeling we can have is anger. Because I think sadness is not very useful. Like you go into bed and like, I think anger is a very useful and productive and like if emotion that we need to channel correctly, in my opinion. So I think anger keeps me going. It's always thinking about these inequalities. And I think doing something like that could get people angry, right? Like, and I think it could be, I think we need to explore as many options as we can. Like, we need to realize where we are and the responsibility we have as adults who understand this crisis, like for all the people who have no voice, like people in very poor areas and babies, right? And we just need to understand the responsibility that comes with that. Like, education is a privilege, and we need to use any means we can, I think, given the state of emergency and the trajectory, which is suicidal.
Great. Another question from Marion. What is the situation for climate activists in Mexico in terms of legal protection, etc.? Is it safe? Can you be open about it? And how is the knowledge and willingness in the population for change?
Yeah, I think it depends on the type of climate activists. So I think academics, we have a lot of privilege, and I think we're quite safe. There is a lot more right to protest here than in Europe. However, I would argue that the real climate defenders are indigenous communities, and those are not well protected.
Yeah, in fact, they're often killed.
Yeah.
Bill writes, if the planet collapses, the rich and powerful would also go down along with everyone else. Given that, why do you think they continue to do what they do? Ignorance, short-sightedness, self-delusion?
I truly believe that this system has changed the way we think to an extent that even billionaires think they have no option. And I think they know perfectly well, and I think they're scared. And I think they just can't even imagine a different world. And I think that's how successful this economic system has been, that we can't even allow ourselves to imagine something better. And I know a climate journalist who was talking like sort of undercover with like CEOs from Shell and Exxon, and they were like, "This is so scary. The climate crisis, is it too late?" And so not even them have like feel like they have the alternative. And I think it's all very systemic in the sense that CEOs have to increase shareholders' money. Shareholders don't even know where their money goes. And if they don't get an increase in their money, then they fire that person and hire somebody else. So it's all so detached. Um, so people don't know that putting their money into like private finance institutions will probably lead to climate crisis, right? Like because somebody will manage that to increase your money, and that's probably like Lockheed Martin or Exxon or all of these enterprises. So I maybe they do believe that there will be a magic technology that will suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. I don't think they necessarily understand tipping points, because if you understand tipping points, you realize that, you know, once you cross the tipping point, it doesn't matter what you do. You can suck all the carbon you want, but the system will transform unstoppably. So they probably don't know to the same extent as scientists know, and that's why we need to inform everybody, because I think few people understand the concept of tipping points. But I do also think that they don't allow themselves the possibility of imagining something different. And they will say, if it's not me, it's somebody else, so I might as well do it and enjoy meanwhile. So that's my view, very personal view on why billionaires do what they do.
That's really interesting, and I think it's a great way to spin it. They're not evil, they're also brainwashed.
Yeah.
What we need, personally, what I think is that we need an intervention because we live in a cult that that won't question the intrinsic value of growth.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, when you really think of GDP, like I mean, it's impressive, right? To think that, you know, unhealthy people will contribute more to GDP than people who go out running. And that's why we really need to question everything in our world. Like honestly, when I go salsa dancing, it's like I'm doing this for the climate. Like it's I mean, it's, you know, that's not polluting. I mean, maybe there is some light, but you know, other than that, it's quite a nice way to.
Cool. Okay. Um, Editing this for Jeff Beeman's question, we need a more dedicated messaging research arm with focus group kinds of techniques. So I guess it's not really a question, it's just a point there.
Yeah, so that's why I want my slides to be available so people can download them and just use them to, like, if they're helpful, to talk about this everywhere, in every school. I think that's what we should do, just share and, yeah, speak.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. Okay, I think I'm through the questions here. We actually only have a couple of minutes before the top of the hour. And so I'll just say, ask you, Ornella, if there's anything else you wanted to say, or if there's a way for people to get in touch with you or find out what you're up to, or learn more about what you're talking about. We'll
Yeah,
put
I
the
mean, what I can do
slides.
is
Go ahead.
I can share again my email, I think, so people can also email me if they want more. Where is it? Oh, here, sorry. Yeah, and this one. So that's my personal email, and that's like the Mexican. I'm actually not sure if we're still on X, because there was this discussion whether to leave or not, and I can't remember what was the consensus, but still, Instagram were there, and this is my personal for the slides. And yeah, for me, it's also exploring. So, for example, I gave this talk to students who make political posters, and now we're going to use them in protest with information behind about like why fast fashion, why inequity, why CO2 is dangerous. So it's also like another way of exploring communication, which is through images. Like the plane is also, I think, quite a powerful. Here, this one. So that's another collaboration we're doing, like with artists, to try to like communicate in another way. And yeah, so the other thing that I think can help is contacting journalists, independent ones, and really talk to them, and because they already have like visibility, right? So rather than having our own like YouTube channel, which will take a lot to grow, I think that's other ways. So something we did in SR Mexico is contact influencers in TikTok. So we had meetings with them, and now they're going to prepare videos about climate change and inequality and economic system. So really, it's just trying all ways possible, right? We don't know of all the things we try if something helps, but you know, yeah. So trying to contact influencers, I think, could be a good strategy. We're trying that in Mexico, and luckily we have now a collaboration with somebody in Instagram, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. Partnering with influencers and collaborating with artists, we can certainly do that. Well, on behalf of Scientist Rebellion Turtle Island and all of the people here, I would love to say thank you so much, Ornella, for sharing your words with us. I wish we could all like have a little you in our pocket that we can like stick in our ear when we need to find that exact right common sense, of course, thing to say to people. But we'll all work on channeling our inner Ornellas.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
Yes. Yes, and keep an eye out, folks, for the next talk in our Buen Vivir series. Have a great day.